Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the live stream. Myself, I'm Pyotr Kurzin, geopolitics, former part of the UN World Bank, so on. We're joined by Professor James Ker Lindsay in Cyprus, an expert on statehood, conflict, and, well, international relations, and Professor Michael Rossi, an expert on Eurasia and, well, comparative politics. I think that'd be fair to say, Michael, right?
I can do that. Yeah, that's fine. I got my PhD in that stuff, so yeah.
This is a bit of an emergency podcast. We usually do these on a sort of bi-monthly basis, but given what's happening on top of everything else, which is sort of one of the first points I want to make, we are seeing finally the event, as I put it in my video on my channel, about these two, Israel and Iran, and the all-out conflict, which has been the event analysts have been predicting for decades, and many have been fearing much more. I think what I want to say first off is that in any other time, we would have been absolutely astounded by what had happened in India and how quickly the media cycle and our attentions have shifted away because of what's happening in the Middle East, let alone that we've seen exchanges between India and Pakistan for the severe time in 25 years, let alone the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. The point I'm making is that global instability is just unprecedentedly gone. Peace dividend is gone. The frequency and magnitude of conflicts and just sort of volatility is at an all-time high and only seems to be getting higher. But there's a couple of things that I think is worth noting from this. Number one, Iran seems to be unable to sustain its rounds of missile barrages at the rate that Israel can. They're technically a wave below, which demonstrates that they either don't have the desire to use all their missiles that they can, or that they're just not sure how to respond completely. Second is that now, in the short term, Israel may well have won the battle of sort of trying to prevent Iran from getting the bomb, but in the long term may well have motivated the Islamic Republic more than ever to actually get it, because they do not have many other deterrents left. And then thirdly is, of course, the Donald Trump effect. Trump seems to be on this edge of wanting to get involved, and a lot of Republicans are keen to do that. Bibi Netanyahu's dream of finally doing what he's thought of doing for decades is here. And there are a lot of Americans, Pentagon and all that, who sort of see this as an opportunity to finally take down Iran and the Islamic Republic, a systemic threat, and by extension cripple the also axis that, particularly the Russians and maybe the Chinese and the North Koreans are a part of. So a few random thoughts from me there. We've got many more, and James and Mike will have their own. So, I mean, maybe James, maybe we should come to you first, because you are in Cyprus, and the British have sent more jets to the region, and we have two big bases, whether or not you like that, in Cyprus, and you, I think, are overlooking one. So, I mean, what are you seeing on the ground? I can't believe I'm saying that, but what are you seeing on the ground? Is there a lot of activity?
Well, no, I mean, Cyprus is very close to where everything is taking place. I mean, that much is clear. Some of the missiles were visible from here in Cyprus just a couple of nights ago. I didn't see it. I was tucked up in bed, I have to say, but there were sort of videos going around showing the missiles, and it was sort of reported in local media here. So Cyprus is incredibly close. I mean, for anyone who hasn't got a map handy, essentially it lies pretty much off the coast of the Middle East, pretty much directly east to where I am at the moment. You have Syria. You just head down slightly southeast from that. You get to Lebanon, then to Israel, Gaza, and then Egypt. So it's really, really very close to the scene of what is happening at the moment. And obviously there is a certain degree of nervousness. I mean, there's nervousness because, as you said, there are two large British bases here in Cyprus. These are sovereign base areas that were created at the time when Cyprus became independent in 1960. You've got a very, very big British air base, RAF Akrotiri, which is sort of over to the west of where I am at the moment. But on top of that, there's obviously also the concern that, if missiles overshoot for any reason, could they head towards Cyprus and things? So, obviously it's something that people are more than a little nervous about. But at the moment, obviously, the key focus is what is actually happening in Israel and the Israeli strikes on Iran at the moment. So yes, it is obviously being watched very, very closely here, just like everywhere else. But we are that little bit closer to the action.
Haven't the Iranians used the Syrian government to relay a message to Israel? I believe that was something I read this morning.
I didn't see that particular report. The Cypriot government, you mean?
Yes. They apparently, according to the BBC and another one, maybe you can look into it, they've sort of used them as a go-between.
I thought what you said the Syrian government. I was thinking, blimey, I hadn't seen that report. No, it would have been a completely, that was a significant shift in everything. Look, it could very well have been the case. I mean, the interesting thing about Cyprus is that it's undergone quite a significant shift in its foreign policy over the past decade. Traditionally, Cyprus was very close to the Islamic world, very close to many of the Arab countries. Not because Cyprus, I mean, you know, you've got the division on the island, and I'm not going to go into all of that now, but the government of the Republic is led by the Greek Cypriots, so one would wonder why. But in actual fact, because traditionally Turkey had a very, very close relationship with Israel, Cyprus had built up a very good relationship with many Arab states, and including, although I know it's not an Arab state, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so, yes, Cyprus had certainly had those sort of good relations. But what we've seen in the past decade is that it strengthened its relations with Israel for a number of reasons, partly because Turkey was starting to reach out to many of the Arab states. We saw that at the time of the Arab Spring. But it's also to do with energy exploration, natural gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in fact, Cyprus has built a very good relationship with the Israeli government. And so in many ways, it would be a natural go-between in some ways. I mean, Cyprus insists that relationship with Israel isn't to the detriment of its relation with various Muslim countries. So it wouldn't necessarily surprise me that, you know, and there are some countries which have been playing this role. I mean, for example, the Swiss for many years were the go-between between Iran and the United States. For example,
well,
you know,
Swiss was handling Oman, the Americans and the Iranians. I think to contextualize it with what we're currently seeing, obviously, the Iranians and Americans have been in these talks about trying to reestablish a kind of a limitation on Iran's nuclear program, even though...
Yes, I mean, diplomatic. When United States and the Islamic Republic broke off diplomatic relations, Switzerland was acting as go-between for a very long time, so for many decades. But you're right, I mean, Oman has been the go-between on the nuclear talks between the United States and things. So yes, I mean... And Cyprus is very much trying to send the message that it can perform this sort of role. I mean, you know, it's also an EU member, and it's been very active, for example, in trying to get aid to Gaza. So yeah, that would certainly fit in with the bigger picture.
I think James as well. Like, just to Michael to bring in you on this. What's notable, also, out of all the many notable things, I guess, is how quickly. At least for my interpretation, I see it like this: is how it's interesting how quickly the Kremlin and the White House can have a conversation as soon as it's about another regional issue and crisis, because actually those two know that they are still sort of quote unquote the arbiters of peace in other parts of the world, the Security Council and all of this. They haven't spoken for ages, and then suddenly they're having a conversation hour long, and they both agree that they should start fighting. Interesting that, and also that obviously the hypocrisy of the Kremlin over the comments and Iran's actions or Israel's action, etc. But Michael, I wanted to bring you in on that because you're are you in DC?
No, I'm in New York.
Oh, you're in New York. Okay, you weren't part of the fandom of the parade then.
Yeah, and you know, let me just point out that, you know, it's bad enough that our Mad King had to deal with the radical left yesterday ruining his birthday, but now we have to bring in the Zionists and the Islamic Republic as well, starting a war. I mean, can Trump just get a day just to himself? You know, obviously, you know, it's clearly the world just does not like him. You know, it's not. Well, I'm not surprised that Trump and Putin were talking regarding yesterday, considering that they already established a communication link or reestablished a communication link a number of weeks ago regarding Ukraine. I don't know if in a parallel universe, Putin would have had the same conversation with Biden or Harris. But they are talking, and it is largely because one assumes that the other major power has the ability of reining in one of these two within the Middle East. And let's be perfectly honest here. As far as America's response, Trump's response is concerned, depending on whether Israel seems to have the upper edge over Iran at the time, Trump is either saying, yeah, I knew about this all along, I gave the approval, of course we're in the know, or we're not getting involved. This is Iran's fight. This is Israel's fight. We will provide support, but we are not going to get ourselves actively involved in this conflict.
But doesn't it demonstrate that actually, because they can establish a crisis communications hotline, if you like, that quickly over another issue, that really Putin doesn't actually want to go to war with the United States, at least directly, right? The sort of the desire for peace in areas that they don't have direct control or activity over supersedes their, their rhetoric. Like all the point I'm making, all this hot air rhetoric around sort of, the US this and Russia that, and then actually you see at times of crisis elsewhere that the real diplomacy comes through. I think
I don't think he ever did. I mean, unless you buy the rhetoric coming from the EU and a couple of war-hawky states in NATO, Russia never wanted war with the United States. Russia has said, Putin has said repeatedly and categorically that in a multipolar world, the United States remains the preeminent world power, but needs to understand that the world now has other rising powers like the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, the Iranians, the Brazilians, among others. So it's, for people who are somehow surprised that Putin has suddenly reached out to Trump, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what they have not been paying attention to since Trump was inaugurated, but the two presidents have been in communication with each other. This seems like a natural and logical response.
Fair.
I think we need to.
I just wanted to read
quite clear that.
We've got some comments. No, I just wanted to, because lots of people are talking about Russia. We will definitely do more on Russia in a bit, but I think we're going to focus on.
Yeah. No, I think the key thing here is this is it's not about whether Putin and Trump talk. We know that that's been going on. I think what is far more important, and you realize this in diplomacy, it's when officials are talking with each other as well, and saying, right, okay, what are we going to do to manage this? This is absolutely crucial in these situations, as a conflict management. But I think there is also a bigger picture in all of this. I mean, I'm rather reminded, of course, of what happened in the Caucasus and Russia's role there. That whether Iran feels that Russia should be doing more to support it. I mean, Iran and Russia have formed a very close relationship. We've known that in recent years, a very unlikely relationship when you weigh up against their history. But they have formed this very close relationship. And it's one thing that has been proven from all of this is that Iran is significantly weaker than many thought. And I think this is probably the big picture that, we should be focusing on just at the moment is that, you're right, Pyotr, when you say that this is a conflict that many had feared for decades. I mean, we know since the Iranian Revolution, Iran has presented Israel as, along with the United States, as its key enemy, that this has been ramping up. There's been a shadow war that's been fought for a very long time. We've seen this fought through proxies for a very long time as well. I mean, we've seen Hamas in Gaza, we've seen Hezbollah, we've seen the Houthi. There was obviously the relationship between Iran and Syria, Iran and Iraq in many ways, which went from war into a slightly different, Iran still has quite a lot of influence over Iraq, which is an element that doesn't tend to get reported so much. And so there was this great fear of what happens if it all kicks off. And we've seen this ramping up over the past 2 years, not just all those old proxy wars, which have been going on for a very long time, this secret war, if you like. But it's actually become more and more open. I mean, we've seen the drone strikes that have taken place. Then we saw the exchange last year. And then this happens. And what has been absolutely stunning in many ways is the superiority that Israel has managed to gain in this. I think we'd had a sense of it last year, but this is the fact that not only were to launch such major strikes, but to be able to take out so many senior figures has been, that has, I'm sure there will be many Iranians who are absolutely shocked by what they've seen, and
there's a lot. There's a lot we could go into. I think it's worth. I know you're not a military analyst, guys, but I really do want to cover a little bit. I think it's worth talking about what they've managed as it stands. Right, if we take stock of the current situation as it stands, I'm live on X all the time at the moment, doing these spaces, talking about this. So my mind is very much about all this at the moment. Like Israel now controls 50% more or less of Iranian airspace. Everything west of Tehran, Israel has basically established air superiority, and if they take over the entirety of Iranian airspace, that's air supremacy. Once you get air supremacy, it's near impossible to overdo that. And who's going to come to their aid, right? We can maybe speculate this on a little bit later. I find it incredibly unlikely the Russians are going to do anything. They can't seem to use their own air force to deal with Operation Spiderweb and the Ukrainians in their own airspace. So are they really going to leverage some of the military assets that are as valuable as their diminishing aircraft over a strategic partner? I don't think so. Also, the Ukrainian thing is very interesting because quite clearly the IDF and Ukrainian intelligence, Mossad, have been maybe not directly working together, but they're learning from each other. The pager attack that happened against Hezbollah last year was certainly an influence over the way that Operation Spiderweb was done earlier, in May. And now we've had this event. And I think that all these things coming together, along with the fact that clearly the Israeli government felt that if the US and the Iranians were going to get some kind of deal, then they maybe wanted to sabotage that, or Bibi felt that now is the time he had to move. The speculation on the motivation of that, I'm not pretending to know what Netanyahu is doing, but also keep in mind that this is all happening with Gaza in the background. And from context that I have in the UN, and I'm not as experienced as you guys, but your emphasis, James, on backdoor diplomacy is a really important one I want to underscore, because in my time working in the UN sphere, you see so much work going on between countries trying to communicate with the ones that are directly in a war between each other, sort of to try and get some kind of talk going. You might have 3 or 4 go-between states, right, to get that going. And the point I'm making is that it was quite clear to some people that France and a few other Western nations were on the verge of potentially recognizing Palestinian statehood. And maybe Israel doesn't want that, and so they want to shift the focus. Again, this is kind of speculative, but it points to the layers that we're talking about. Now, I want to do some housekeeping as well. We've got quite a big audience. So, we're going to I'm going to be monitoring the comments, and we're going to, obviously take your questions and things like that. But yeah, we're going to try and cover as much as we can.
I just have to point out that Wade has said Iran is so weak that they hit the IDF, MOD and Haifa fuel terminal. Look, Wade, nobody's saying that Iran hasn't struck back, but if you believe that the Iranian response is anywhere close to what Israel has done, then it's probably
they're a way behind, mate. Like they
exactly. It's probably pointless having this this conversation of trying to persuade.
I'm not going to dismiss that Iran is a capable, potent force. It's not Guatemala. No offense, Guatemalians, but you still have to treat it with respect. It's still very capable.
But it has taken an absolute hammering. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, that is just simply the reality. This was a conflict that was feared for many, many decades, and it's now playing out.
The other thing is this all point about air taking down one single F-35, if they've even managed to do that. That's one military asset. That's not enough to the entirety. I've read one report earlier saying that the Israelis have taken out the Iranians' production of radar. Their entire infrastructure and base where they produce radar systems and things like that is gone. And if they've
taking out the military chief of staff, taking out the commander of the Revolutionary Guard. I mean, seriously, it has decapitated the Iranian armed forces. And yes, Iran moved to replace them very quickly, and it will have been. So I'm not saying all this to glorify, but I think what, this was a conflict that we were fearing for a very long time, and Israel has emerged very, very strong from this. Of course, there is the bigger picture of what happens next, how long, because Pyotr, you make the point. I mean, Israel might have gained air superiority, but where does all this go? We aren't going to see a land war, that much is clear. And perhaps the saving grace in this whole situation is that they aren't neighbors, because I think then we would have been dealing with, it would have been horrific.
No, I want to. Michael's sitting there probably a bit like, left out. But Michael, to bring
no, I'm not left out. I'm
here.
just reading. I'm waiting for everybody. I'm waiting for the analysis of Israel's first sucker punch to be analyzed.
Well, I think
the thing is that look. Let's be
Michael. Let me ask you a question on that, and then you can go off on it.
Sure.
But so the Americans obviously are the ones that are the only capable with the bunker busters, and Israel is actively gagging at this point on Netanyahu, at least for them to come in. And so it comes to the question of what is Israel's objectives here? Do they just want to do enough damage that the primary higher leveled or whatever, not as deep, shallower in nuclear facilities are gone? Do they want them to come in so that they can take it out completely 100%? Do they want regime change that the US does something complicitly as well, or they just support them indirectly? What's your, what are the end games here? What's the military objectives there?
No, they want the American evangelical Zionists within the military-industrial complex to get involved in a war that Israel started and that America will finish.
Interesting.
Full stop. I mean, look, I agree with James. Israel achieved significant advantage over Iran in, I wouldn't call this a preemptive strike. This is a sucker punch. A preemptive strike is when you know that you're going to be hit by the other country and you attack them first. Israel should be awarded the Nobel War Prize. If there ever was one, we need to give it to Netanyahu. I mean, the man has been consistently successful in scuttling any kind of negotiated settlement between Iran and the West for the past 10 years. Ever since the JCPOA, which was initiated under President Obama, was started, which by all accounts was working. Iran was cooperating with UN nuclear weapons inspectors. And there were two people in the world that were upset by this: Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. And Trump because he could gain political leverage over this, and Netanyahu because he's just a guy that loves to find the shatter point to scuttle any kind of settlement between the West and a non-Israeli country that is hostile to Israel in the Middle East. He was able to scuttle JCPOA when Trump was elected in 2016. Trump pulls out of JCPOA. The negotiations continue for years without the United States. Iran was complying up until recently with the IAEA. The narrative that Iran is building a nuclear weapon is based on Israeli intelligence, which sources are little more than "dude, trust me, bro." And the United States,
I think you have a fair point on that.
And a number of war hawks in the US that are complacent and allied with the Israeli state take this at face value.
I think that there's a fair amount.
The understanding that negotiations with Iran were slow but moving in the right direction were seen as detrimental to Netanyahu once again, who successfully was able to manage a crisis in which Israel will attack Iran, and the United States, as I have said repeatedly here and elsewhere, looks at Israel as an indispensable ally around the world. We will throw any other country under the bus except for Israel, and Israel knows this, okay? Netanyahu's biggest and most valuable, useful idiots live in Washington and to a lesser extent in London. And he knows that they are not going to allow Israel to fight this alone. Even though Trump says this is not our war, Rubio says we're not getting involved. We have given Israel the weapons, the money, the diplomatic immunity, the military green light to do what it will do. And if Israel is now asking the United States to be actively involved, it means that their opening salvo largely depleted most of their capability to attack Iran. Israel is a country of 10 million. Iran is a country of 80 million. If you honestly believe that Israel is going to single-handedly destroy the Iranian state just by itself, you really need to get out of the neoliberal bubble. And if you honestly believe that the population is going to rise up against the Islamic Republic in the name of Israel, I mean, look, let's be honest here. The population of Iran does not like the current government in Tehran. This is another thing that we need to discuss about on the ground here, how unpopular the government is. But when that government and the population are now attacked from the outside by Israel and by proxy the West, I don't want to say that this is a whole rally around the flag effect, but suddenly people that were critical, Iranians that were critical of their own government, are going to be even more critical of the international attack on that country. So Israel has thrown the firecracker into the crowd and is now expecting larger countries to come in and help it.
Michael, I would say a couple of things to that, which is, I just want to make one quick point, which is, because I know James, and it kind of bleeds into what I'm curious what you think, James, but like, you are right, Michael. I personally was never, well, there's a difference between the government or the regime and the people, as I think we know. I hate the Islamic Republic, but I also really can't stand this ultra-nationalist Israeli government. I hate both of these entities. I do not think that if we had a more moderate government in Israel that this might be happening. And if it was, it wouldn't be under quite the same circumstances. I like to believe, maybe falsely or whatever, some people on one side of this argument will think maybe, that the JCPOA was working and that it wasn't a disastrous deal. But equally, this is the Islamic Republic, and the mullahs are not exactly the most trustworthy group. I worry about whether or not they really were complying longer term, or whether it was fainting and that they were continuing to do enrichment in some of these much deeper facilities. But equally, attempting to deliberately scarper the negotiations, which is what a lot of people believe, is not necessarily good. And this is where it brings in my question to you, James, or sort of a point that I was listening to another podcast made very well by Rory Stewart of the UK, which is that this is arguably a preemptive strike in the eyes of Israel. It is a, strike done to ensure self-preservation because of an existential threat. However, the gray zone around that in international humanitarian law is high. And some people have said that this is not within, well, it's not legal. And what Israel has done is not right or illegal at all. So there is a huge debate now around this. Is it a preemptive strike or just an act of aggression against a state that was, well, is obviously a destabilizing force, but ultimately was not doing anything quite this level? So I don't know, James, what's your thoughts on that?
Look, I think this is one of those situations where you can hold all sorts of competing views that aren't all incorrect. I mean, you can take lots of different positions. So you can take the position that yes, Netanyahu has quite clearly been warmongering, but I think you can also take the view that as leader of Israel, that Iran had just been judged by the IAEA to be in breach of its obligations. There has been a lot of concern that it's been on the verge of producing fissile material. That this is a regime that, listen, there will be a lot of people out there who will just simply probably be cheering on Iran because it's anti-Israel. Fine, take that view if you want. But the reality is that this is a regime that has spent almost half a century declaring Israel to be its eternal enemy, to wipe it off the map, to eradicate it. And it's on the verge of producing material which will allow it to create a nuclear bomb. And at that point, you have to say that any serious Israeli leader would have taken the view that, do we strike? And there was a lot of people who felt that maybe Iran was trying to string the US along to give it the time in order to complete that process. And I realize there will be a lot of people watching who will take a pro-Iranian position, people taking a pro-Israeli position on this one. I'm just simply saying, right, okay, let's look at all the different factors that come into this, that, and let's not build up one side against another or anything in it just because you don't like the other. But at the same time, let's not view Iran as the complete victim in all of this that many people want to present it as saying, and that Israel has just carried out this strike and it violates international law. Iran has been developing a nuclear weapon. Now, everyone can say, well, and then you're going to get the view, but Israel's got a nuclear weapon. And yes, it's widely accepted that Israel is a non-declared nuclear power. But again, if you look at the broader
who's
context,
allowed, I'm going to be devil's advocate, James, who's what, because the United States is the de facto biggest military power with the most hard power, that they can de facto tell everyone that you're not allowed a bomb, you can have a bomb. I'm being devil's advocate deliberately, obviously.
No, I mean, look, the reality is that
who's America and Israel to say to the Iranians, you can and can't do this?
It's not for America and Israel to tell the Iranians.
Are they not?
Pyotr, it's not for the Americans or the Israelis to tell Iran that they can't have a nuclear weapon. It's for the international community. There are treaties against this. Unfortunately, what we have seen is that countries have violated this. I mean, it's not just Israel that has done this. I mean, India, Pakistan have violated the prohibition on developing nuclear weapons. North Korea has violated the prohibition on developing nuclear weapons. And the reality that Israel would say is that once you have developed those nuclear weapons, it's very, very difficult to close that barn door. And then you create a much more dangerous situation. So look, I am just trying to say that, listen, one can understand, and of course, there will be lots out there who would say, yeah, but it's just Netanyahu wanting to be a warmonger. Absolutely. As I said, you can have two different positions on this. It doesn't mean that they're both wrong. Netanyahu can be a warmonger, but he can also have made that judgment that this is getting to a dangerous stage that he cannot allow to continue.
Well, James, also keep in mind, also for everyone on the audience, we're all friends here. Like, Michael and I have our opinions. James and Michael. Like,
yeah. I'm just trying to say from a detached point of view.
For sure. This is why I think it's so surprising for people sometimes when you actually get three people who disagree but can also get along. And I think that's why we enjoy.
I mean, you raised the point about who is it for Israel to do this? Israel's got the power to do it quite clearly, although, as was raised, and I think we also need to wonder, what is Israel's longer term game on this? Because the point is, it can't just stop this process with
James,
the airstrikes.
But the moralistic and well, just whatever, the big question is, though, you're a man of international law, and if you're saying that Israel basically has the capacity to do whatever it wants, we're entering a really dangerous and unprecedented time now that sort of, excuse me, but fuck it, fuck the rules, based order, the one that we are supposed to be upholding as the West. That doesn't matter anymore. What precedent does
look, I'd be a little bit more sympathetic to this, and I'm to be really, really honest. I'd be a lot more sympathetic to this if Iran hadn't spent 50 years talking about wiping out Israel, frankly. That is the bottom line in all of this. This is not, I think that adds a very different complexion. And however one feels about it, I would just like people to bear that in mind. I'm not here to play advocate for Israel by any means. I've been extremely critical of its brutal war in Gaza, which I think has crossed the line quite clearly into genocide. So I'm very happy to be very critical of Israel and its behavior. But at the same time, I don't think that we should be treating Iran with rose-colored specs and thinking, right, it's just the victim in all of this is of Israeli warmongering. It is a regime that has declared for half a century it wants to wipe out Israel and has been developing nuclear weapons. I think most countries would say, if they were confronted with a foe like that and they were in a position to do something about it, that they would act.
No, fair enough. And again, I'm not trying to be deliberately. We've got a lot of people listening. Some people I'm hearing, I'm reading messages on the comments, and people are saying, this is the first time I've seen these guys. This is really good chat. So I think it's important to have the conversation and be blunt about it.
Absolutely. This is an incredibly important issue.
Let me throw this in. I mean, so James, by the rationale, Iran for the last 50 years has stated on it, thing, right? Israel needs to be wiped off the map. Death to America. Right? Those are the two rhetoric. That's the thing.
It's not just a rhetoric, Michael. Let's remember that it has been funding Hamas. It's been funding Hezbollah. It's been funding the Houthis. It was supporting the Assad regime. It's a little bit more than just rhetoric as well. There's been a systematic attempt, and there has been effectively a shadow war fought between these two countries for a very long time. But it's on the verge of reaching territory that makes it that much more dangerous.
So the big question then is this, because in addition to Iran, we have a country like North Korea that's effectively stating that a number of other countries also need to be destroyed. Rhetoric is one thing, capability is something else. You just said before that you've said before, Iran does not have the capacity to do what its rhetoric claims it to do. What do we then do? I mean, countries say a lot of things. Do they have the capability of following up on that? Israel says a lot of things as well. Do they have the capability? Do they have by themselves, even with all of the money
that's
that
the whole
my
point, Michael,
country gives them, the green light, the vetoes at the UN Security Council, the genocide that they are committing right now, which I know you can't be committing the two things together. You know, it's sort of like, the greatest thing about
the IAEA had just judged
that Iran is that the Israelis are still committing genocide against the Palestinians. But
yes, and that's something which as I say, I condemn. But I, at the same time, understand that the IAEA has just said that Iran is in breach. There is a substantial body of thought that believes that Iran has been stringing this process along. I naturally would have preferred to see a continuation of the diplomatic process. And I'm not here, as I say, to act as a spokesman for Israel. But what I am saying is that let's not treat this as just, Iran is the innocent party in all of this. It had just been held to be in breach of its obligations by the IAEA. There is a significant body of thought that believes that it's on the verge of being able to put together a nuclear weapon.
I've got a question that I sort of want to throw into the mix here, because I think it's worth doing. A lot of the comments here, I see this not only or merely as sort of, it's about Iran versus Israel. It's about a broader movement, or when people support Iran, what I'm seeing a lot of comments are, it's about a resistance. So do you think sort of, is it one of the biggest, I think, ambiguities around all of this is just how supported the Islamic Republic regime is. There's a lot of debate that Iranians don't like it at all. They hate it and they want to throw it over, etc. But then there's the other argument, which is that, well, people sort of have been living under it and gotten used to it. And the West obviously overplays that because it benefits their narrative of wanting to get a more pro-Western government in. So it's sort of, do as many Iranians inside the country support the regime, or is it more outsiders, people who see what the resistance of the Islamic Republic actually believe it more than it is? Do you know what I mean? How much of it is actually Iranians versus people who see it and think the support of, because it symbolizes resistance against Israel, resistance against Western hegemony and US interference in the Middle East for decades. These themes often come together. Under this sort of similar point, which is to sort of, stop Western imperialism. Well, personally, I do think that the Iranian people would like more options. Maybe they don't necessarily dislike the system as a whole. I don't know. I really am not an expert on intricate internal Iranian politics, but, or maybe I'm blindsided my preference for a more, liberal Iranian. It's one of the oldest countries in history. It's one of the most remarkable countries. I'd love to go. So that's sort of what I think one of the biggest issues is not even about the exchanges happening right now. It's about the double standards thing, I guess is what I would summarize it as. And clearly you guys have quite different views on that. I mean, admittedly that you're not necessarily disagreeing that what Israel is happening in Gaza versus what's happening right now, but it's sort of more, you frame it slightly differently. I don't know if that's what I'm trying to sort of summarize what you guys are, debating about, right?
So let's take the Iranian perspective. Let's leave Israel out of this for the moment, because I think that you raise a rather good question here, and that is that the global response, the Telegram response, the internet response tends to be pro-Iranian rather than being pro-Israel. And let's divide this up. You have the people within the country of Iran. You have most of us are outside of that. And this is not a quantitative analysis by any measure. But I think that the support for Iran has less to do with the Iranian government, less to do with the Islamic Republic as it is, and the idea that Iran is, I'm sorry to say this, giving Israel a taste of its own medicine from the last 1.5 to 2 years. So you see the visceral reactions on Telegram videos of Tel Aviv being hit, Haifa being hit. And it's finally being like, aha. The Israelis are finally, who have been cheering for 2 years about what they've been doing to Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, mind you. And they're finally, chickens are coming home to roost. I mean, this is just a visceral internet response. When it comes to Iran itself, let's be clear. Most people outside of Iran don't know what life is like inside of Iran. And James and I will agree on this, I would say 100%, that the Iranian government has been in power for nearly 50 years and is unbelievably repressive, but at the same time, unbelievably corrupt and largely inept. I mean, it is sort of this old crumbling system that is trying to hold on to some kind of ideological dogma, which I have not been to Iran. I know people from Central Asia who have spent a good amount of time in Iran, both in the past and in recent months. Large parts of Iran today are populated by people under the age of 30 that have little to no love for the government. The strict use of Islamic dress, the veils, everything else, largely gone in northern Iran. People are just going out wearing as much secular clothing as possible, dyed hair, pierced ears, tattoos. I mean, some of the most, cosmopolitan looking people out there. Now, that doesn't say that these are people ready to overthrow the government and support a pro-Western, pro-US, pro-Israeli ideology. But what it means is that the population, and, I can't help but think about other countries that have people that hate the government, but suddenly that government fell afoul of the West, whether it was Milosevic in Yugoslavia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, whoever it happens to be, but suddenly they become under attack from the West. And the West now effectively says this whole country is ideologically committed to this one government, where the people inside are now forced to ally with that government against the outside. So it completely destroys any nuances that the public might have. And of course, the fact that the country is attacked by Israel means that, opposition to the government, opponents, dissidents, they have no love for Netanyahu. They have no love. They have no trust for the West. But any attempts at trying to reform the country from within are now scuttled, because the hardliners are going to look at this and say any dissent from within can be seen as a threat to the regime.
So what I would say is that, again, it comes to what I'm reading in the comments, because I'm trying to balance, navigating the conversation, but also, people do seem to appreciate that we are letting each other air our thoughts without, shutting it down, or it's not an echo chamber, which I think is part of the point here, that there is such a vitriol on either side. And that's exacerbated by the extremity of the Israeli current government. Keep in mind, Bibi Netanyahu is indicted for several stuff. And some people are arguing that it's about, trying to keep... But, I mean, they're already wanted in The Hague under international law for war crimes against the Palestinians. Don't get me started on Ben Gvir or Smotrich. I deplore those two. But on the other hand, you do have this ideologically based entity which has a very clear objective about Israel. Now, people argue whether or not the regime, the Islamic Republic, that is still as ideologically driven as it once was, because the more it has to survive, the more it has to retain power, the more pragmatic and survivalist it has to become. You kind of have to drop some of that ideological extremism. And I whilst, we can argue that Iran was more of a paper tiger than we thought or whatever, what is illustrative is how much they do leverage diplomatic channels when they want to, right? I'm thinking of the diplomatic communiques they use via the UN. They didn't go straight to one country or get another one. They sent it to the highest level of multilateral diplomacy to try to emphasize that we don't want to do X, Y, and Z. So it's quite interesting that on the one hand, Iran says these things, what Khamenei and others are saying, versus what they actually do. It's a bit like sort of Medvedev in Russia and then what the Russians are saying versus stuff. You know what I mean? James, you want to jump in? I'm sure, but
no. Look, I just listen to what you've been saying, and I think one of the other things that I've been following international relations long enough to remember debates that were taking place in the 1990s. I mean, the reality is, so look, if you want to present another side of all of this, to say that, one of the things which has strengthened Iran over the decades, one of the things which has made sure that the Middle East, and I think this has changed a little bit, though, in the past decade for a number of reasons, but it was obviously Israel's failure to deal with the Palestinian issue, to set up a two-state solution. This was something that antagonized a lot of people across the Arab world. I think that this has, as I say, changed. I think, what we've seen with the Abraham Accords under the first Trump administration was the first real signal that many Arab states had lost interest in the Palestinian issue. But it is still something that for many people is an important issue. And I think Iran has managed to play off that. So I think, we've also got to recognize in all of this that, that is an issue that has made the Middle East so much more unstable over many decades and has provided excuses, rationales, whatever, justifications, whatever you want to call it, for many of these attacks on Israel. So I think, that is another reason why many people will also be saying to Israel that this is an issue that now has to be dealt with. And I think it's very interesting, for example, that we are seeing this French-Saudi Arabian initiative on Palestine, because this has got to be resolved somehow, because it remains a sore that just keeps coming back and needs to be dealt with. And
well, I think it's worth also taking stock, James, that sort of keep in mind also for audience, this is not a full-fledged Iran. Part of the reason Israel has probably taken these moves or decisions to act so unilaterally, there's debate about how much the United States knew. I think obviously Bibi instigated this in November once he knew Trump was going to be the president, but how much the US has been involved tacitly versus explicitly is, there was a Wall Street Journal article I was reading yesterday saying that the US is already acting on the ground, at sea and in the air in various capacities. Obviously the Jordanians, the Saudis have cut off their airspace to the Iranians and given subtle protection in the past rounds we've seen in September and April of last year. So point I'm making is that there does seem to be tacit support for the Israelis at the expense of the Iranians. But then there was another article that was saying that the Saudis were actually trying to communicate with the Iranians over Israel's actions in Gaza, because they were the Arab Gulf states have had enough of the Israeli government's operations in the Strip and West Bank and the encroachment on Palestinian land. Now, I personally think that Palestine should be a state. I don't understand why it's not. But equally, it's not easy to do under the current circumstances with this Israeli government. So there's so many layers is what I'm saying here. The Iranians have lost their sheer crescent. Just to throw in another curveball, right? Sorry,
but Pyotr, this is, if I could just simply say, this is why I said that, and I think I really would say, and I'm going to wear my policy analysis hat now, is that, two competing truths can both be true. It don't sort of make this that because you believe one thing that something else can't be true. And it comes back down 100%. To it that, there are a lot of countries out there that might hate what Israel is doing in Gaza, but also have no great love for Iran. And just say, and as you said, you're closing off airspace and things, don't want this escalated. Iran is not the great savior. And I think that a lot of people might be sort of taking this view that they don't like what Israel is doing in Gaza. And so Iran has got to be the good side in this story.
Yes. Yeah. I support I don't know, the Israelis' fear, or I understand the Israelis' fears over Iran. I want there to be a Palestinian state. However, I find it extremely difficult to see how it exists in its current format.
There are
I hate the Israeli government, right? Just because I hate the Israeli government doesn't mean that I hate all Israel or something like. The amount
and
of
I just sort of wish people could be a little bit more detached to understand that and make those connections.
Why does it have to be so binary?
We need to also understand something here, is that those that are making the connections between what Iran is doing in Palestine, I think, are wishful thinking here. Iran has not said anything about Palestine. There are two countries in the world right now that do not want a Palestinian state: Israel and the United States. That's the reason why it doesn't exist. And the Arab countries within the region can voice all the rhetoric that they want about a Palestinian state. They haven't done a single thing. And the reason why the Saudis are every so often are getting a little antsy with Israel is because they're not done committing genocide. Commit genocide and get rid of them already. That's the whole problem. They're still there, and it's pissing normal people off. And the reason why, look, Israel's not going to stop at this point, because you know what? You're already implicated. You already got two cops with the sirens behind you going 120 in an 80-kilometer zone. You think you're just going to pull over now? Have a little fun. Make it worth your while. That's what Israel is doing. They're not stopping.
Wait, so Michael, if I understand you correctly,
the Israeli government, the Israeli political officials, you get rid of Netanyahu, you're going to still get the same thing. I know there's some people think all we got to do is get rid of Netanyahu, everything is all fine and good. No. You're going to get
let me understand correctly.
They are going to continue with the eradication of the Palestinian people because they are already so far into it at this point that if they stop, they're going to be implicated for all kinds of crimes against humanity.
But Michael, let me understand.
Michael, if I can just stop you.
No, so I do want to sort of, to Michael, to sort of, are you suggesting that the Gulf states aren't doing anything, because are being more passive because Israel's basically doing it for them? Is that what you're saying?
The Gulf states say a lot of things, but at the same time, they're in the same pockets as the U.S., and they are deeply connected to the Israeli states.
Yeah, okay. But the Abraham Accords, the MBS clearly wants some form of a relationship with the Israelis. Egypt was the first to do so very quickly after the is it Yom Kippur? Right. So
it's in the late 1970s, and you had the Camp David Accords.
But so are you saying that so the Arab states are largely rhetoric about their brothers and sisters in Palestine, but in policy and action, they're not doing anything because it benefits them?
No.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Right. Okay. No, I want to make sure that I'm not missing.
No, I mean, on that I agree. I mean, it's quite clear that the leadership in a number of Arab states has made the decision that, for whatever reason that is, that Israel is here to stay. That the rhetoric of decades of wiping it off is just held now by a small handful of countries. Most have just reconciled themselves, if not for full recognition, as we've seen with the Abraham Accord. So, I mean, just to remind people, I mean, as Pyotr, as you said, Egypt was the first to recognize. Then you had the Palestinian Authority, PLO, that recognized. Then Jordan did. Now, Mauritania did and then withdrew it. But you've also got Bahrain, you've got United Arab Emirates that have recognized, you have Sudan that recognized, you have Morocco that have recognized. So, there's a number of states. Saudi Arabia, many felt, was on the verge of recognition. I thought that it was probably coming sooner rather than later, but obviously everything that we've seen, with October 7th, followed by the war in Gaza, has made that politically impossible at the moment. But there was no mistaking the fact that before that, the relationship between Israel and Saudi Arabia was becoming incredibly close. And if Saudi Arabia had made that decision, it would have had a huge symbolic significance. There was no doubt about it. I don't think it would necessarily have had quite the same practical significance. It wouldn't have meant other countries would have necessarily fallen into line. I don't think you would have seen, Syria, for obvious reasons, wouldn't have followed. Iraq wouldn't have followed, I don't think. But it would have been symbolically hugely significant to see that. And I think that what we have seen is that more and more Arab states have just simply said, look, we're not going to allow the Palestinian issue to determine our relationship with Israel anymore. And I think, Michael, in that sense, you're right. I think there will be a lot of people who would be saying that, if the Arab states had been more willing to lean on Israel, then maybe things would have been different. That it isn't just about the Western European countries doing it. Where's that indignation, that very, very vocal indignation, or even from those countries that have recognized Israel, saying, listen, you either make some moves on this peace deal, or these recognitions will be rescinded.
Well, I think
that we need to, but we also need to add one other thing here. Making peace with Israel's existence is based on the 1967 arrangements, a two-state solution arrangement. The UN recognized 1967 borders with an eventual Palestinian state comprising of the West Bank and Gaza. Now, if this were the only issue, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But it's increasingly difficult for many of these Arab countries to continue to turn blind eye and deaf ear while there is an active engagement of ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and settler colonialism in the West Bank. The governments can continue to remain steadfast in supporting Israel and just kind of saying, we don't want to deal with this touchy issue. The public thinks differently. And that's not just in the Arab-speaking world anymore. That is increasingly in the Western world as well, to the point where bringing this up, bringing empirical evidence up, now all of a sudden has you run the risk of being called anti-Semitic, simply for pointing out what is apparent happening every single day.
No, and Michael, I agree. And, you know, let's not forget that there was a very important advisory opinion that came down in July last year from the International Court of Justice, which said on the request of the United Nations, which wanted clarity on the matter, which said that Israel is in the process of annexing the West Bank, which stands absolutely contrary to UN Security Council resolutions and the basis of a settlement. And they're absolutely right on this. And this should have been far more called out by countries. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think, you know, we can point very, very clearly to all sorts of violations of international law that Israel has carried out. Its annexation of the Golan Heights, for example, which took place back in 1981. I mean, you know, there's a whole litany. I mean, that's not. But again, I return to the point that, you know, we also have to recognize that, you know, this is a country that has faced an existential threat from Iran for a very long time, and Iran is not a pleasant, you know, regime, as you point out.
I do want to not go too much down, I think, the Palestinian route, not because I don't think it deserves a thorough conversation about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the question now is, what this means for the wider Middle East, I think.
What does Iranian? Well, that's sort of what I wanted to pivot the conversation. I mean, I would underline the Palestinian aspect is sort of it from the Gulf states or Arab states viewpoint. It's a debate around moralistic principles versus strategic interests. On the one hand, you have them releasing the statements, the Qataris, the Saudis being very unequivocal in their support for Palestine and their brothers and sisters, as we've seen from the foreign ministry of Saudi Arabia. But their actions, well, they're not doing anything. When the Jordanians and the Egyptians are not willing to take the Palestinians, not that they should have to, obviously, this is not something that should be happening in the first place. That calls into question sort of what really is driving the governments of these countries. And I noted one comment, I think not from my channel. It's difficult. Unfortunately, I can't tell whose channel it's coming from. Otherwise, I would mention that. But they were sort of saying that, keep in mind that the authorities, the people who lead these Arab states, were the entire Middle East as it currently is cut up was carved up by the British and the French predominantly, and you know, and so those countries have had a role, quote unquote, historically in putting entities, in with sort of interests that are benefiting of the West or something like that. So I certainly think that has a role to play, but I don't want to go too far down the historical context rabbit hole, because right now we have missile barrages ongoing between these two, and it's this sort of increased isolation and the unprecedented sort of erosion of Iran's perceived influence and power that is part of it. Yes, of course, again, they are capable. Don't get me wrong, audience, that I'm only saying that the Iranians don't have any ability to do anything. That's not what I'm saying. But my point is that they have lost Hezbollah. They have lost an entire nation state in Syria, which I think was the biggest fact, because you can argue how much of that was related to events preceding it, i.e. Iran and Israel events. But if Syria's government regime change had occurred at any other time, a couple of years ago, that would have been huge. But it's so lost, blurred in everything else. And the sheer crescent that goes from Lebanon all the way down to Iran was such an intrinsic part of Iran's destabilization or whatever regional influence strategy. And so now what does that leave us? That leaves us with the Badr organization or whatever, these militia groups that are dotted around Iraq, and the Houthis. And one interesting scenario I sort of have mentioned in a couple of posts on X and my YouTube page was to what extent could the Iranians, I'm doing scenario thinking here, to what extent could the Iranians target directly French, British, American bases as they've threatened to do, right? Mm-hmm. I'm sort of bringing it full circle. We've been on the air now for an hour, and we started this conversation a bit like that. An alternative that seems to be gaining traction is that the Islamic Republic shuts the Strait of Hormuz,
yes,
which is 20% of oil supply. The Houthis control the Gulf of Aden, and that's obviously a massive shipping lane into the Suez Canal. What does that do to oil prices? They go up. That benefits Vladimir Putin and his war and his coffers for his campaign in Ukraine. But also it puts pressure on the United States, because if there's one thing that the US doesn't like other than war escalation, it's economic uncertainty. Yes. And so will that be the trigger point that the Americans either get involved directly, or they put pressure on Israel to stop its strikes because they don't want Iran to be blockading the Gulf of whatever, this sort of dual strategy, right? Do they have the capacity to do that is another question. But these are sorts of some of the thoughts that are going through military analysts, geopolitical analysts, and so on. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix because I think it's quite interesting. Is Iran going to go fast and just go and get the bomb? Now are they just going to go whole hog, head down, and just go for nuclear enrichment 100%?
I mean, one never knows in these situations, but I mean, I'd be surprised if Iran were to go against British, French, American targets.
Yeah,
because I think that it would involve them. I think it would be more likely. All right, so we Pyotr, as you said, there's a number of different factors here, and it's trying to work out what the end game is in this. Is the thinking now in Tehran? We have taken a serious bloody nose. Maybe it's time that we really sew up this deal on limiting our nuclear capabilities. We really want to pursue this for peaceful means. And
do you think Israel's going to allow that, James?
No. But this is the thing. This is what the negotiation has been about. I'm just trying to sort of say, right, okay, there's two particular avenues, if you like, that you would imagine that the Iranians would be taking their view on. We've suffered a hit. We've suffered a defeat, and a fairly stunning defeat at the hands of the Israelis. They're not going to say it publicly as such, but is this the thinking that you're going to have in certain corridors within Tehran that would just simply say, let's cut our losses and come back and do a deal? Or will the view be, this has proven exactly why we need to press on and have a nuclear weapon and just say, right, okay, we're going for it? And at that point, does that then bring the United States into it? Because if Iran then does look like it's going for it, and if the Israeli influence on the United States is as strong as has been suggested, then that becomes much more realistic. And I think going against British, French, US targets is going to be so. Really, I think the argument at this stage would be, if Iran is genuinely interested in pursuing a more peaceful relationship generally, then it would be to say, right, okay, let's get this deal sorted out.
Well, I do want to just
look. As I say, this is just trying to think. How would it be that decision makers would view this? And can I just say one other thing? That I mean, one of the things I'm always very aware of, and and I always would say to students is, it's one of my 3 points of policy analysis I always emphasize is, it doesn't matter what you know to be objective truth. Nothing matters less when you're trying to understand how parties are going to respond in any given situation. It's the dictum, what people perceive to be real is real in its consequences. Never base your analysis on what you know to be as objective truth. Yeah. What you have to do is think, right, what is it that the parties will view as objective truth, whether that's real or not, because that is what's going to drive their decision making.
Well, keep in mind, a huge proportion of this is the war of narratives.
Yeah,
and both have
no. We have the war of narratives, but I'm saying you've got to go beyond that and think, how is it in any given situation to, if you like, almost climb into the mind? What will people in Tehran, what will decision makers be thinking at the moment? And it's a very, very difficult one. You get into all sorts of cultural issues, and this is why people who know countries, and I'm going to give a big up to the area studies community in this world, you know, the people who actually spend their lives studying countries, studying regions, so that they understand those cultures, that they understand the languages, that they, you know, understand the thinking that goes behind it. These are the people that, frankly, more and more sort of foreign ministries need.
It's not just a case of thematics, is it? It's area studies. I think that's an area.
Yeah, but it's precisely to try and give that understanding.
I do want to make one point quick, which is that the Iranians, as we talk about, you know, their options and choices, they've launched another wave now. A comment I saw was from an Israeli. He's had to go into a bomb shelter. So, you know, whilst we're talking from our respective parts of that, I also just want to be sort of, you know,
but also, I mean, you know, sometimes
there are real people.
We have to understand that, you know, different cultures work in different ways. And I remember, you know, this was really clear. I remember very much, and Michael, you'll remember, Pyotr, you're probably a little young, but it has now entered. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way.
No, I know. It's
the reality.
I'm a lot less.
I remember the run up to the Gulf War, not the Gulf War I, but you know, the US invasion of Iraq. A lot of people said that if Saddam Hussein didn't have WMD, why didn't he just come out and make it very clear? Why didn't he just let it? Because it was a face-saving thing.
Yes.
For him, he needed to be able to show that he was standing up to the Americans. He couldn't be revealed for being the paper tiger that he really was. And so he would rather have gone to war, a war that he probably knew he could never win, rather than be seen to be capitulating. So and I think this is why, as I say, sometimes you've got to understand, because I remember at the time, a lot of people didn't understand, why is this? Why is he not just saying, let in the inspectors? And let them get on. I think the reality in that situation is Bush was itching for a war. I mean, Michael, you'll remember exactly what it was
absolutely. Like. There was no question about it. There was no question about it. So, look, I mean, you know, in a way, James sort of answered the question that I was going to pose to him. And this is the reason why, at the end of the day, we're on the same page. And that is, objective truth is going to always be marred by narrative. And, you know, the big question is that we're asking is, what are Iran's options? Have they taken a blood? They have been hit significantly. In fact, just in the last few hours, you know, Israel had hit their sewage system. So now parts of Tehran are flooded. Does this mean that the Iranian state is going to collapse? No. Have they taken a have they taken a beating? Yes. Both countries have basically they're committed to shooting themselves to hell at this point. Iran's actions are largely going to be based on the perceptions of one of two things. The first is the United States going to fully involve itself in defending Israel? Most analysts who know U.S. foreign policy are going to say they will, because there are no greater Zionists in the world today than those that are running my country. And this is not just Trump, and it's not just Lindsey Graham, and it's not just Chuck Schumer, but it's the idea that, look, last week there were debates for the mayor of New York City. And a question, not a satirical question, a serious question was forwarded to all of the candidates. Two things. One, would you visit Israel? And two, do you believe Israel has the right to exist? To which any rational response to somebody running for mayor of New York City is, I'm running for mayor of New York, not Tel Aviv. What the fuck does this have to do?
Wait, Michael, can I just interject with some news? So I am monitoring I've got X on my screen as well. So I'll let you continue. I just wanted to, according to the Jerusalem Post, which is an Israeli paper, so maybe they're being biased, the Iranians are seeking a ceasefire with Israel, which I would be surprised because they've just launched another round of rockets, which is not exactly going to incentivize the Israelis to do so. But it shows you the multiple layers of diplomacy going on in the background. And I saw one comment saying that I don't contribute anything because I'm a drag on the discussion. I mean, I'm a bit younger, guys. I mean, I wasn't around when the Gulf War was happening. It was 91. I was -2. So I think that's a bit unfair.
Oh, Gulf War One.
Gulf War One. Yeah. But the other thing the other thing I wanted to say is, what was it, about 2 days ago, Khamenei had also said that if, any country that aids Israel gets involved, we will attack their bases. We will attack their military bases, to which, and I mean, any sane person would say that this is a death wish. I mean, you attack an American military base, British friend, I mean, American, more or less, that is all the pretext that they need. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you have a Democrat or a Republican in the White House. I mean, we have Trump. When his ego is wounded, trust me, he retaliates. Take a look at what's happening in the U.S. now. So it would be absolute suicide for Iran to widen this conflict against American military or industrial locations within the Middle East as well. I know that there are many in the United States that don't want this, that do not want to be brought into this conflict either. There tends to be this assumption that we have a never-ending supply of ammunition, of missiles, of guns, of soldiers. We don't. I mean, we don't. We also don't have the capability, I think, of taking over a country with a population of 80 million. So if we get ourselves involved, I mean, look, we promised.
Well, Michael, no one's saying that. I think I do want to make that quite like there's not going to be a ground war in any way, shape, or form, right? Reuters has reported that Trump vetoed the suggestion of assassinating Khamenei. So clearly I do think there's a division here in how far to go. Is it a whole regime change in the eyes of the Israelis, or is it simply crippling their nuclear capacity to the extent that they are not a vassal state, but like a parastate, a former state that sort of is a rump state, a sort of rump state that is a husk of its former self, and then eventually people do rise up and throw over the government. Is that sort of what they're trying to stimulate? Again, this is not an endorsement; it's speculation.
No. I think you're absolutely right, and Michael, you're right. The idea that there would be any ground intervention in a country like Iran is just that is not going to happen. But Pyotr, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I could see a situation where, if Iran did attack Western countries, then I could see heavy retaliation, and it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility that they would insist then that and harking back to Gulf War One, of course, was the no-fly zone.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, how far can they do that?
And Israel saying that, look, we will now control your airspace, and we will be keeping it very close. If you try deploying any ballistic missile launchers, they will be destroyed. If you try doing anything, it will be destroyed. I
maintain, James, that Iran is still a credible risk, right? This is not a small state, and
no, not at all.
There is one particular country that I'm aware of that could go further in helping them get, quote unquote, the bomb, right? It's not the Russians. To answer a question from the comments earlier, but no, the Russians do not want the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon. That's pretty clear. And I think even if you're pro-Russia, pro-US, it's pretty clear they don't want the Iranians to have a nuclear weapon.
I think
There's another country that's even more reckless, which is the North Koreans. And the North Koreans have already had a role in providing information to the Iranians historically. And given their growing exuberance, shall we say, in international playing or international affairs, right? What they've been doing in Kursk and supporting the Russians. This is emboldening Kim Jong-un. And I wonder whether or not the North Koreans could be a player, again, behind the scenes, who help fast track, streamline the Iranians, especially if the Iranians are crippled as they are with the loss of their proxies. What do the North Koreans want or need? They need another strategic partner, another ally, quote unquote, to counterbalance against the West. And so to see them fall, I don't think so. But then, of course, there is Russia. Would a Russia allow Iran, quote unquote, to fall? I don't know if they have the bandwidth to really do anything other than strong rhetoric, which is why they're trying to get a peace deal, because Iran is so integrally important for Russia's actions in Ukraine, the supply of these suicide drones, kamikaze drones, which are $20,000 a pop, which is nothing. The average American drone, I think, is 50 million. Turkish Bakati drones are 1.2 million. So the point I'm making is that Russia needs these drones for their own interests. And so Russia might not get involved militarily to support Iran, but actually diplomatically to prevent the further destruction of its facilities, let alone the state's survival, just its infrastructure that Russia needs for them to produce its military equipment for its own war campaigns, right? I don't know if you disagree with that, guys. And also, I do want to just fling in the big elephant in the room, China. What is China thinking at the moment? How far would they be willing to go to support Iran? Because they are very important, dependent on Iranian energy supplies. Iran does have a role here. Pakistan's comments in the past couple of days and their unequivocal support for the Iranians, is that vis-a-vis Beijing, or is that Pakistan's own choice? Because a lot of people see Pakistan as a pariah state or a vassal, or whatever, a delivery, mouthpiece for Beijing at this point.
Well, the Caspian trade route, the Caspian trade routes, the Caspian pipelines are effectively an alternative to the Suez, and so it makes sense for countries like Russia and China and Pakistan to ensure that the government in Tehran stays where it is. So, obviously, with everything that's happening as quickly as it is, from what you've been seeing from Jerusalem Post, let's take it at face value here, if they're calling for a ceasefire, then let's see what Israel does. Because if Israel is calling for U.S. involvement, let's not overestimate Israel's capability as well. Small states have the ability of doing a lot of damage when they are given carte blanche support from great powers. And Israel is a great example of this. If the United States says we will not get ourselves involved, or if the United States under the Trump administration realized that Israel under Netanyahu is more of a liability than an asset, you'll be very, very quickly amazed at how fast Israel also was willing to reach an agreement. Remember, in the 80s, I forget when this was, Reagan threatened to cut off every single dollar to Israel. And who was it? Was it Yitzhak Shamir or Yitzhak Rabin? I forget which one. My apologies for not knowing the prime minister at the time. They quickly capitulated. Netanyahu does what he does because he knows that he has his closest allies are not in the Knesset. They're in Congress.
Sure. Now, it's interesting. I feel like we've got a big audience here. I mean, this is quite a far wide-ranging conversation. Everyone, is streaming to X and also to our respective YouTube accounts. James and I do international stuff. Michael does fantastic stuff on Russian stuff. I wonder if you'll be covering this from your perspective, Michael, as well. But, I do wonder about the great power politics of all of this. As I said, for me, it's not often the most flashy things that can reveal some of the more important shifts. And I mean that in the sense of the diplomatic communiques between the Americans and the Russians. I do think that is something to watch more than we might think, because, again, I just don't think the Russians are getting involved. They don't have the capacity to do so. They can't risk their own military assets in their own airspace, let alone getting involved directly. I mean, they let Syria fall, and they were fighting there for 10 years against Islamic Republic, against the Americans indirectly, against the Kurds or whoever, the Turks as well. So are they suddenly going to do so for a country bigger and more strategically interested? Well, maybe if they didn't have their war in Ukraine. So I really question the extent that the Russians are going to do more militarily, intelligence-wise, or trying to sort of, provide non-lethal aid. This is one debate people are talking about, that maybe the Chinese are sending non-lethal aid to the Iranians. But that's not enough to offset when you've got all your infrastructure being destroyed left, right, and center. And the other thing is that there was this oil depot that was burning yesterday significantly. I forget the name of it, but people were really fearing that that could become a Lebanon 2020 disaster, which would be, and we know how much that crippled Lebanon's economy as well. So there's a lot of elements here, and obviously all of this comes back to also Mr. Trump. He's such a we talk about specific countries as a collective, but then we talk about America, but then it's just him. What is Mr. Trump thinking in his mind? Is he thinking that, yes, I'm going to green light the Israelis to continue indefinitely? The Israelis have this campaign. They said it's going to last weeks. Do the Israeli people have an appetite for that? Can they stomach that for weeks, having to go into bomb shelters every day at random times because another barrage of missiles from Iran are coming? I'm not sure how sustainable this this campaign, if you want, by the Israelis is. I do think there was going to be an exorbitant amount of pressure from whether or not the Israelis seek to listen to it is another matter. But equally, if they don't get their bunker bombs from the Americans, then they can't really do further than they already have. They can't really do more than they've already have. So sort of, even if they want to continue, they may be constrained by sheer practicalities. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, guys, but James,
two things is that, and you started off this by pointing this out, and I absolutely agree. And that is, Iran was given, as I said, a major sucker punch within the first few hours, but they've managed to get back on their feet. The exterior structures of the nuclear facilities have been hit. The underground has not been touched. They're members of their high command, and at least a dozen top-ranking scientists have been killed. The military high command has found replacements. Scientists can be replaced as well. Infrastructure can be destroyed. Infrastructure can be rebuilt. So Iran is bruised, but it's still there, and it's still able to launch missiles. The Iron Dome, that was much vaunted as being this impregnable fortress to protect Israel, has proven to be nothing more than rhetoric. The Israeli...
Michael, I think that is...
Michael, it's done a bit more than that. Come on.
I'm not seriously, it's not. No, come on. I think
I'm sorry. Let's be honest here. They've hit the oil refinery in Haifa. They've hit Tel Aviv, right? So are you agreeing with me that, yes, the Iron Dome is overrated, or I'm talking out of my ass?
It's not infallible.
Yeah, okay.
But it's, to say it's over, it's nothing is just quite clearly not the case. And as I say, I'm not doing this in order to take a sort of a particularly sort of pro-Israeli position. I just think from everything that we've seen, but the fact is Iran has launched barrages of missiles. And if we can sort of probably count on the fingers of one hand the serious things when Israel has decapitated its senior military command, effectively controls the airspace over Western Iran, we know that on one of the major nuclear facilities, Israel has not been able to do the damage that it would have wanted to do. But we know that that's because it has been built incredibly deeply, and that Israel doesn't have the technology to hit those missiles. But I think, we just need to be a little bit, when making the assumption, it's not about wishful thinking of, what we would want Iran to do against Israel. And I think there will be a lot of people who will be following this situation and be wanting, and we see this. It's not just in this situation. We see this every week when we talk about Ukraine and Russia. The number of people who come on and start sort of spouting absolute, about how Russia is about to steamroller over Ukraine because they want it to be true. And I think we need to be really, really careful in sort of, separating out.
James, if I can add another element to that, which is sort of the claim or suggestion on the more, should we say, Iranian leaning side, is that Israel would not be able to do any of this without the help of its allies. And ultimately, if it was just Israel in a vacuum and Iran in a vacuum, Iran would be decimating Israel. I don't think that is accurate personally, but how much is it that Israel does depend on foreign support in times like this?
Yeah, but Pyotr, this is international relations, isn't it? I mean, you know, it's pointless saying it would be a very different fight if Israel didn't have the United States. Yes, it would be, but it does, and so that's the discussion that we have to have. I mean, there's no point saying, you know, let's make this a fair fight, you know, as though it's some sort of boxing match, and you're telling one of the boxers don't put bloody, you know, don't put a bloody horseshoe in your boxing glove and stuff like that, because that isn't the rules and everything like that. This is international relations. We know that this is the reality is that Israel is supported by the United States. That is not going to come as news to anyone. And a lot of people would say, but this is an absolute outrage and everything. Yeah, but that is the reality of the discussion.
Yeah, there's no point talking about what
has Russia behind it, and Russia isn't going to be, from what we can see, isn't in a position to do very much and isn't inclined to do very much. And if anything, you know, one could argue with oil prices going up the way they are, then Moscow is probably sitting there thinking, let this conflict continue as long as possible, frankly, if this is just going to send up the price of oil, because their economy has been hit.
Well, I wanted to ask that, and I wanted to give a shout out to Be Marketing. This is the latest one. There's been plenty of you saying that, but thank you. I think it's pretty balanced as well. We do these on a bi-monthly basis. So if you want to see more of that, then, you know, follow all of us or one of us or something. You'll find us as well. If you're watching on X, then, you know, follow me on X. I'm covering things live as well in Spaces. But yeah, I mean, what do you think is the objective? You should be on X as well, Michael and James. You guys should be active.
No, I'm sorry on that one. I frankly, I was tired of every time I loaded it up being confronted with Brazilian snuff movies and stuff like that. Frankly, gosh. I didn't.
Wow.
I do have an X account. I log in maybe once a month. I'm on it for less than 5 minutes, and I realize why I log in only once.
Yeah, exactly. It's a horrific place.
Wow, we've even found
I know you've got a big following over there, and you know.
But Michael, you'd find a lot of people who align with your perspective on things, and I think you'd be very actually popular amongst the should we say Palestinian and Iranian line groups that, you know, feel as passionately as you do about elements of this issue. I feel you're missing out. You could be huge. You could be the new Jackson Hinkle. I'm kidding. You're far more substantive than him. I'm kidding. If you don't know who that is, don't worry, everyone. He's a deplorable person. But anyway, I don't know. So what is the end game here?
Michael, the new deplorable person.
Yeah, right. No, it's not. I'm joking. But like, no, sorry, that's bad.
Deplorable Marxist. How about that one?
No, yeah, we are two liberals and Marxists, right? No, but so what do you think happens next? I guess as we've been going for an hour and a half. I don't know how long we want to continue. We could talk about this indefinitely. We've got a lot of
absolutely, but
I mean, where do you want to go?
I mean, look, what happens next is Israel has its ace in the hole, and that is its Western support, diplomatic, economic, even military, if need be. You know, yes, I absolutely agree with James's assessment that you know, people say that it's not fair that the United States is going to back Israel in this fight against Iran. I mean, look, the United States has been backing Israel and defending it from, you know, in committing genocide for nearly 2 years. You think they're going to sit by and do nothing now? Even when we say we're not doing anything, we are going to do something, right? I mean, we say we're not involved in the war in Ukraine. We're absolutely involved in the war. We're not going to involve it. We are absolutely involved, not directly, but indirectly. So there is, you know, Netanyahu can realize that he will have blank check support from whoever is in the White House, Democrat or Republican. My country is ideologically, morally, intellectually, just whatever, wedded to this state. For right or for wrong, for good or for ill. That is just bar none. As I said, you will not find more vocal, adamant Zionists in the world than in the United States. Evangelical Christian Zionists are absolutely committed, especially when we are not just defending Israel, but we're defending it against Iran, the country that is one of the most demonized countries in American political culture, worse than Russia, worse than North Korea, right? Iran is public enemy number one. So for us, this is a Hollywood movie fight that we absolutely are going to get ourselves on one side against the other. And if you're in favor of that, great. If you're against it, I know, but that's just, this goes, again, the narrative that Pyotr, you brought up, and James, you also mentioned, which we're all on the same page. Objective empirical observation is one thing, but the way in which people perceive other countries is really going to determine how foreign policy is conducted.
I think that on the point of war of narratives, the Iranians are, the ball is pretty, I think the ambiguity comes around the Iranians' move set, in the sense of, it's pretty clear what the Israelis want to do, or at least the Israeli government wants to do. And they are the ones driving this, well, offensive, figuratively and physically, right? They're the ones that shifted the goalposts on Thursday when they undertook the moves that they did. Things you can argue whether or not the Iranians were negotiating in good faith, but, and stalling and feigning attention away from whilst doing whatever they were doing with the nuclear enrichment, right? That's harder to prove, but clearly what we can see is what has happened since Thursday. And so now the Israelis are in the driving seat in terms of what they're trying to achieve. Now, the debate is it full-blown regime change, or simply a sort of an incapacitation of Iran's nuclear assets and infrastructure to such a point that they have no choice but to negotiate with much more clearer or on goodwill. But as it stands, they have pulled out of the negotiations today. They are, not seeking to, there's no clear time horizon when those might return. Trump is saying that they should make a deal, but at the same time, the Americans are acting on support of the Israelis on the ground, in the air, and in over the sea. Carrier strike groups are being reorganized around the Gulf as we speak. So on the one hand, we've got diplomatic communiques. As always, the military arm moves either in tandem or in contrast. And so I don't personally see this going on for weeks. I don't think there is an appetite for that. Equally, because what's quite interesting, actually, is we have a very engaged community here, but sort of, if you look at the live streams, right? So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine fully in 2022, you can go onto the live, how BBC or different mainstream media outlets have their live coverage thing, and you can see that X amount of people were watching. When that happened, I think more than 500,000 people watching live on the BBC feed. Right now, 30,000 people are watching on the BBC feed. I know it's a bit of an arbitrary metric, but the point is that people seem to be increasingly desensitized or immune to these events that are happening. And it's because there is no, I think, immediate threat, imminent threat of a ground invasion. And continual airstrike exchanges doesn't carry the same weight. So how far does this go? And I think that, the Iranians are going to try to want to frame this from the fact that they have been on the receiving end of an unwarranted attack, and they were simply trying to negotiate peace. And if they can pressure the Americans to put pressure on the Israelis to stop, then you might begin to see steps forward in the diplomatic sphere. I don't think the Americans are. I don't know, it's really hard to tell. If the Americans do get involved, obviously with a bunker blast bomb, then we are whole hog in, all-out military scenario. We're going to destroy all of the Iranians' assets, etc. But if the Americans remain on the fence and somewhat restrained, then the Israelis are not going to have the ability to achieve their maximalist objectives of regime change. And have to settle for this.
Pyotr, I completely agree. I mean, I think a lot of this is going to depend, isn't it, on how Trump is feeling about this. So he'll be looking at it. As you said, do I go all in with military support for Israel, or do I still chase my Nobel Peace Prize? And I think the Iranians, so the first step will have to be some sort of ceasefire, and then I think it's not going to necessarily be straight back into sort of nuclear talks. I think there would probably have to be a cooling off period. I think the Iranians would want to sort of save face a little bit that it hasn't, been immediately, because they have suffered such a bloody nose. But I think, the hope would be that would be the direction that it would be going in.
But how much, James, is that dependent on Israel's operations in Gaza? If the Americans put pressure on the Israelis to stop their campaign in the Gaza Strip, then that will appease the Iranians to stop, their side, and then maybe that, do you not think there's an element of Gaza in that?
I mean, that would be an interesting way of approaching it. But you also wonder if even though Iran has for a long time held itself up as the champion of the Palestinian cause, that now would be enough in its own right. But it could, listen, if the Iranians are on the lookout for a face-saving way, that could be a very powerful way of doing it. You're right. That the United States can say to the Iranians, look, we will now lean on, and let's also not forget that just a few weeks ago, and I mean this wasn't just idle speculation, I mean it was something that was being talked about by a lot of very serious news organizations, was that there was a split between Trump and Netanyahu.
Hang on, but that's part of the speculation. How much of that was smoke and mirrors? How much was that all part of some,
you can take that view, but the fact is that Trump paid a very, very high profile trip around the Middle East. He didn't visit Netanyahu. He was quite happy to take Qatari money for a gift of an aircraft and things, that he was being feted in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Trump is we all know that is at heart a businessman, and this was a very, very powerful symbol. Saudi Arabia has had a rapprochement with Iran in recent years. So it's not entirely beyond the realms of possibility that, people would just immediately, there will be those who dismiss it and just say, oh, no, it is smoke and mirrors. But I think, there were enough serious voices that I respect that were saying that this is something's not quite right with this relationship. Trump is not happy with Netanyahu. So I don't think it's quite as smooth. And we haven't seen, let's just remember that when all this kicked off, I mean, Marco Rubio putting up that message very, very quickly saying nothing to do with us, was very, very interesting, that it was a sense of distancing. And I know that Trump has since sort of, seems to have rode back on that. But I did see the analysis that said, he has to in some ways. But yeah, so I'm just sort of saying, look, keeping an open mind about what is going on and trying to evaluate all the different factors and trying to make sense of it, and where we go from here. I mean, the idea that so Israel might very well want to continue on with this, but for how long and to what objective? It can't possibly win an outright victory over Iran unless it is seeking regime change. And, can that be done from the air? And it's certainly not going to be done from the ground.
What about this question? Oh, wait, hang on. This one. There are a few questions I thought would be worth covering.
I can't see it. It's coming up very small on my screen.
I will read it
out and announces they have a nuclear bomb. What do you guys think will happen? I want each of your thoughts. That's a red flag for Tel Aviv as well as Washington.
Well, I think, the thing is, so the argument would be that, in other cases where countries have announced that they've got it, then that's seen as game over. They've got it. But I think the context is slightly different in other situations. I could see that would necessitate action. Now, I mean, the thing is, it's not just about building a bomb, it's delivery and all the rest of it that has to go with it.
That's where the North Koreans come in, to me. From my perspective, I'll reiterate and expand on something that I said from the beginning, which was that the Iranians have a very capable bunch of scientists, but they also lack it. You can't destroy knowledge, I guess. I'll reframe what I mean. You can't destroy knowledge. You can destroy the scientists, which the Israelis have done taken out, but that knowledge exists. And whilst the Israelis may have set back the Iranians in the short term, in the longer term, which it's difficult to gauge what we mean exactly by short or long term, they may have ramped up the sense of necessity that if their regime is facing an internal pressure from the people, which again, I'm not sure how much is support or not support for the Islamic Republic, versus also external pressure, then you're going to go whole hog, head down to get the bomb, because a nuclear bomb is independent of, I hate that StreamYard does that, because it's independent of the people. You can have a bomb. It's not like having a big military, which requires you keeping a lot of people on side, right? It's not a military junta. You have a bomb, and you can still be facing pressure from your domestic people, or whatever, right? So it's indifferent to that, but also because it works as a hell of a deterrent to others outside, right?
Yes.
Apart from so that may well be the biggest single asset the Iranians need, or the Islamic Republic regime needs, to ensure its survival, which is what regimes are all about. And then in terms of delivery, well, that's where the North Koreans come in. Again, I don't think the Russians are going to be willing to share this kind of information, be it to finish acquiring the payload versus delivering it. The North Koreans, they've got less to lose. They're the most isolated nation state in the world, arguably speaking. So that is certainly a possibility. And if they come out and announce that, well, that is the biggest question. I've had guests on who are as hawkish, from Jason Brodsky, who are incredibly, moderate and think that the JCPOA was a good thing and valuable. And no one seems to have a consistent answer about what the Americans would do. Right, if Iran is a nuclear capable nation, well, okay, they have a bomb now. Well, that's just it. We sort of find a way to manage it.
So let's expand. Well, let's expand this by looking at, to my knowledge, the 4 countries outside of the original 5 that have now. 2 have officially declared themselves nuclear: India and Pakistan. North Korea is, for all intents and purposes, a nuclear power, and so is Israel. Right, worst kept secret in the world. What is the response to all of these 4? India's declaration of it becoming a nuclear power, if I'm not mistaken, was in 1998. So the internet was not as active in social media as it is today, but that was immediately countered with Pakistan. So the understanding is that the 2 countries kind of balance each other out, and it's just sort of a fait accompli. Israel having nuclear weapons, no one's going to say anything about that, aside from Israel's critics like Iran, among others. North Korea managed, against all odds, to become a nuclear power simply by threatening to destroy any of its neighbors in the event of any attack. And it's not with nuclear weapons, it's just with its enormous stockpile of missiles that are immediately targeting Seoul, Tokyo, among others. So the understanding with North Korea is tread lightly, because they may just decide that today's the day to go all doomsday on the region. Iran's a different story, because Iran does not have, to my knowledge, the military deterrence that would prevent outside powers from intervening. North Korea could also rely on China for complete 24/7 support, as well as Russia. You mentioned the North Koreans might be the wild card in the whole Iranian thing. I would also add Pakistan might be a factor as well. Pakistan has come out vocally in favor of Iran's sovereignty, Iran's nuclear pursuit, as well as its condemnation against Israel.
Michael, if I can just ask you on that, or add to that, because it's sort of more of an open question. When we saw those tensions over Balochistan, which is a separatist,
let's not forget that
Pakistan has been quite. Yeah, that's a good point, actually, Michael. I mean, maybe we should explore that a bit more. That's quite an interesting. I forgot about their nuclear willingness to support, because I think they've already done. Haven't they already provided support to the Iranians in a very subtle way in terms of like know-how?
I mean, to my knowledge, again, I'm not an expert on the field here, but I know that Pakistan is a potential player in this. Note potential. Not, note potential here.
Well, I mean, look, there was the case of A.Q. Khan, who was supplying nuclear secrets, which those of a certain age will remember. That was a very high-profile example of Pakistan providing nuclear know-how, and it got a very, very heavy slap on the wrist for doing so. I mean, the relationship between Pakistan and Iran has traditionally been very close, but in recent years it has come under strain. Pyotr, you mentioned Balochistan. So for anyone who doesn't know, the westernmost part of Pakistan, the largest of Pakistan's provinces is Balochistan, and there's a Balochistan that exists in Iran as well. And in both territories, it's been a bit restive. They're insurgent movements, and both countries have accused the other of supporting each other's insurgents and things. Although, as I say, traditionally, Iran and Pakistan have had good relations. So it's not maybe quite as clear cut as it may have been 10 years ago, even. Something just to bear in mind. But I think, certainly the really big question here is, as you said, what happens if Iran were to announce? And I think that this is exactly why Israel has stepped in at the moment and sort of said, right, okay, we're going to push this back, and then see where it goes from here. But I think the one thing that we can say is that, any attempt by Iran to escalate this by drawing in other Western countries, be that Britain, be that France, be that United States, would be disastrous. That it would complicate matters. But again, we aren't aware of what the Iranian thinking is at the moment. It might be defiance, just simply says, right, we're going to go for it. But it might also be that cooler heads are saying, look, we need to stop this. We're not in a position to beat Israel, and if we want to escalate it that next level, then we could be looking at something very dangerous.
I would also say that what they fear is not so much regime change, but regime weakening. Take a look at what happened in Syria. I guess you could call it regime change with the fall of the Assad government, but I don't think that no three of us here would regard the current government in Damascus as unified, as strong, and as stable. It is sort of the Libyanization of a country, which could very well happen in Iran. There are a number of regional and ethnic tensions within the country that, if given an opportunity by the outside, look, we don't do regime change. You know what we realize in the West? We realize that we can do a lot more damage just by weakening a country, not by installing a puppet government, but just by weakening the country and letting it collapse from within.
Yeah, we've just mentioned Balochistan, but you're right.
One of those major issues. How about the idea that a good chunk of northwestern Iran is Azerbaijani?
Yeah, I was about to say exactly. The Azeri community, the ethnic Azeri community in northwest.
Yeah,
and let's also not forget that there has also been in recent years a very difficult relationship between Azerbaijan and Iran.
Yes. Yes.
And there was actually talk, remembering, it wasn't so long ago that, Israel provided help to Azerbaijan when it retook Nagorno-Karabakh. And there was a lot of thought that the quid pro quo on that would be that Azerbaijan would allow Israel to use Azerbaijani airfields, or, be able to launch drones into Iran from Azerbaijan. I don't think there's been any indication that that's been going on at this time, but, it has been another factor. So it's incredibly complicated, isn't it?
This is why I love these streams, though, because the summary of it. We've covered so much, and the Pakistani point that you raised, Michael, is a really really good one. I completely overlooked it, to be honest, on the nuclear aspect, and I'm going to dig more into that. But also, I think that I don't know if the Syrian situation is quite as bad as Libya. Whether or not you like Gilani, he seems to be holding it together. Maybe you disagree on that, but I'm not sure it's as bad. But what I think is quite interesting is the passiveness of all the countries in between, not willing to get involved. Quite clearly, also the way that Hezbollah were very quick to say, we will not initiate, quote unquote, anything in this matter. The Houthis are clearly doubling down in their willingness to back up the Islamic Republic. But then countries that, Syria doesn't want to do anything. They don't want to get involved. And the emboldenedness of Lebanon in response to Hezbollah, right? In the past, Lebanon government were quite sort of, we can't really do anything because it's Hezbollah, but they've been largely decapitated with the loss of Nasrallah and such. And suddenly the Lebanon government is a lot more forthright. So you do see a shift in the balance of power or rhetoric in certain smaller areas. But I guess, I don't know, for the last, should we say, 10 minutes or so, what would you say you think should happen versus what you think could happen? There's a difference between preference and expectation, right? I don't know, Michael, what do you think?
What should happen versus what, I mean, we've spent the last hour and a half sort of talking about the differures between.
Well, let's let's bring it together, right?
I mean, what I would like to do, I mean, I'd like to address something that James brought up, not anything specific, but a big picture, right? A big picture here. And that is that the Israeli-Iranian issue, along with Russia, Ukraine, along with Israel, Palestine, all of these issues are involving something that is considered by international law illegal, but yet it's happening, right? So Iran is in breach of certain IAEA arrangements. Is it legal for Israel to attack Iran or not? Is it legal for this country to do that or not? This is really the difference between liberalism and realism. Liberalism says, hey, that's illegal. You can't do it. Realism says, stop me, try me. A realist, if you have the capability of doing something, it might not be legal. I will make it legal. I will retroactively make it legal. Israel does not care what's legal or not. They have the ability to do what they're going to do. Much of its political leadership knows better than anyone else that they are hated throughout the world. They know this. They don't care. You might as well just finish out what it is that you're doing. They don't care about public opinion. They're going to do what they're going to do because at this point, you don't back out of a fight that you are already in. If you have a gun and you shoot a large animal, an elephant, and you don't kill it, but you just piss it off, you don't run, you continue. This is what they're doing. And so in that regard, the world that we're looking at today is back to might making right. And
but Michael, no, listen. I mean,
I'm not condoning it, James. I'm not condoning it.
I mean, no, but I take a slightly different view on this. I mean, because I do tend to be the naive view of international law, but in this case, I can also see that international law is quite explicit that you don't develop nuclear weapons.
Well, then somebody needs to remind this to the state of Israel. Oh, and while they're at it, remind them that genocide is not a good thing. I don't know. Maybe they should notice that.
If they're going to preach that.
But we're just, my point was a corrective to the view that Israel is breaking international law because it's attacking Iran on a preemptive basis, and I'm saying that international law is also quite clear that you don't develop nuclear weapons. And yes, we have seen other countries do it, and it's highly regrettable. But this is a situation, as I say, where taking it back to the early part of the discussion, these are two countries which have been effectively fighting a proxy conflict for a very long time. It's been a shadow war that has been going on for many decades. We have seen time and time again that Iran has supported Hamas, it's supported Hezbollah, it's been supporting the Houthis, it was supporting Assad. This isn't just suddenly out of the blue, and Israel has been taking for quite a long time. Now, again, we can come back and say that Israel has also created the conditions for that by not addressing the Palestinian issue. There are all sorts of layers that we can pile onto this situation, but I think it's in that spirit, we also have to bear in mind, if we're going to take some arguments, we have to take all the arguments, and remembering, of course, that Iran has been attacking Israel for a very long time as well. This is not just suddenly Israel picking up and attacking Iran out of the blue, and suddenly Israel is the bad guy in this story. I mean, Iran has been doing its fair share for a long time. And Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And you could say, yes, Israel's got a nuclear weapon, but Israel has never threatened to annihilate, Iran with it. I mean, it might not be happy with Iran, but Israel's position has never been that it doesn't believe in the right of Iran to exist, and it wants to wipe it off the face of the earth. So I think, we do need to balance out the existential element of this. And Israel is in the position to do something about it as well, which is, I'm always reminded, I was appalled by it in some ways, but, it does highlight the reality of international relations. I once spoke with an official about an issue and said, why didn't you take a principled stance on this position? And the response of this official was, what can I say? The country in question chose the wrong enemy. And that, sometimes, for all my support of international law and peacemaking and things, I mean, we can see that there are those occasions.
I think what's interesting is
Iran has been spoiling for a fight for a very long time. And as I say, I'm not going to, I'm quite happy to be critical of Israel, and what it's done in Gaza. I am very critical about what it's been doing in the West Bank, which is absolutely appalling. I highlight about the ICJ opinion, but let's, as I say, keep some perspective on what we're seeing at the moment. Iran has been spoiling for a fight for a very long time. It's picked it.
But James, spoiling for a fight that they didn't think they'd actually ever get, because the perception of their proxy network.
Yeah, precisely. And you know what?
Happened, right? Do you not
Let that be a lesson to everyone. Because if you spoil for a fight, you might get it. And I'm not saying, it's great, the situation. As I say, I've spent most of my career working on peace processes, but I know as well as, sometimes what we're seeing, we've known for decades that this has been a possibility. This is what the opening point in this conversation is. We're now at a point that many have predicted for a long time, a day that could come.
I think what's interesting is that this is so much about the sort of the moralistic versus realistic arguments. Both of you in your own respective ways have sort of emphasized that sort of, I think a lot of people who talk about the injustices and events that are happening in Palestine, we agree with what's happening, but unfortunately the cards don't fall in that way. Israel holds the cards at the moment. And so it's this dichotomy of sort of what you want to have, and that's why I frame the question, I guess, is what I'm saying, versus what do you think should happen.
Yeah,
versus
I just appeal to people that before they think about this situation, whichever side they support, take it in the round, and don't just throw your support behind one because you don't like the other, but actually understand that there is
law and geopolitics. Law and geopolitics don't care about your feelings, unfortunately, and that's not because I'm a cold-hearted person who doesn't care about what's happening, but they don't.
No, but I'm just saying, before people jump to the idea that somehow Iran is the innocent victim in all of this, just remember that Iran has been fighting a battle against Israel for a very long time, and it has now become hot, and it's taken quite a beating, and it's not the innocent side in all of this, but equally many would argue that Israel has been the architect of a lot of, its own misfortune because of the way that it hasn't addressed the Palestinian issue, and it's given a lot of, it's fed a lot of extremism, and extremism that people would argue has not just been targeted against Israel, but has been targeted against Western countries. Again, looking back to the early 2000s, a lot of the radicalism that was being pointed towards the West by Islamist groups, a lot of that was driven by hatred of, support for Israel and the failure to deal with the Palestinian issue. Now, one could also then come back and add in an extra layer of complexity by saying that these were people who would never have been willing to accept a two-state solution anyway. They would have only ever accepted the elimination of the state of Israel. That's as may be. But
I would put this one as the sort of final question: what is a realistic path to peace? Well, that means a less extreme version of leadership in both. As I said, I think the circumstances now would be very different if we didn't have an ultra-nationalist government in Israel, hell bent on, and that's not defending what James has denied, ignoring what James has just said, but you have the most extreme government in Israel's history, also led by a bloke who has had this wet dream of wanting to do this since the 90s. Plus, he's indicted. So how much of this is his desire to stop his own domestic reputation and instability and etc., right? And he's facing war crimes already for his actions in Gaza. So there's a lot of personal elements in this. But then, of course, you have to see some kind of different. I'm not going to call for regime change. I'm just saying you have to see some kind of shift in the power structure in Iran, because we can argue whether or not moderates or reformists actually exist within the Islamic Republic. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole, but Personally, I like to believe that the peace deal was possible and there is still a possibility for some kind of peace deal. But then that depends very much on the third element here, which is predominantly the United States and what this Trump administration really seeks to do. I'd love to remind everyone that at the time we've been having this and rockets were flying across the Middle East, we've had a military parade in America for the first time here since 1991. And Trump is sort of wanting to say that this is about acknowledging the military as much as it is his own massaging his own ego and wanting to put on the sort of, and the White House's celebration of Flag Day, which means celebrating Russia's flag, which has obviously put a lot of people up in arms because it's like the White House really loves Russia or Putin specifically. So there's a lot of layers here from the diplomacy, but also just the personal, and whether Trump is like, I'm going to wake up today, screw it, let's go in. Why not? Let's have a go and see if we can. I can be it can be my crowning achievement of my second term, the eradication of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Maybe he just decides, actually, that sounds better than trying to be peacemaker, which he's claimed to be.
I think, Pyotr, if I could say, my final question ultimately is, could we envisage a situation where Iran would ever be willing to accept the existence of the state of Israel? Ultimately, that that is
changing government.
I think that's it. Has it now built its identity? This regime has built its identity on this, and there's no way back, because the obvious answer would be to say, we need another push towards getting, as we're seeing with the Saudis, as we're seeing the French, towards a Palestinian state. Work needs to be done on that, which would require international pressure. But of course, the United States has been leaning on countries not to attend that meeting between France and Saudi Arabia to discuss this very issue. But, if you were to talk about Middle East peace, it does come down to resolving that. And also saying, as part of that the regime in Iran must be willing to accept the existence of the state of Israel and not pursue nuclear weapons. But it is entitled to pursue a peaceful nuclear program under very strict international conditions. We can see an end game to it. We can see an end outcome. But it's, of course, the question of how we get there. This is very often the case. This is in so many conflicts that we deal with, that we know what the reasonable end outcome would look like.
Well, we had
time and time again, I can think of all sorts of conflicts that I've worked on over the years where we can see what the reasonable end outcome would be. But of course, the art is how you get there.
Well, we had the JCPOA. It was working. Hardliners in Israel said, "Now we don't want that." And
Trump's decision to pull out was disastrous.
And if there's a hardliner in Israel, that there are 2 to 3 hardliners in America that are like, "Yeah, we don't want that either." Why? Because it's Iran and because Israel doesn't like it.
I think we're all on the same page on that front. And on the idea of Iran recognizing Israel, well, surely that depends on Israel's actions in Gaza. If they stop what they're doing in Gaza,
precisely. That's why I said
you know what I mean? I don't know.
You've got to find a way of resolving the Gaza issue, the Palestinian issue more widely. And the fact is, we can't see that happening. So,
good luck getting that to happen. Again, it's not just
precisely, exactly. But we know what.
They have already come up with the final solution. It goes beyond genocide at this point. Some are even calling it a Holocaust. So good luck with that. I wish that minds change, but they've already made up their minds. We're this far in, might as well just refer to them in the past tense.
And on that grim note.
Yeah, well, we will be back. We do these streams often, and sometimes we run for 2 hours, and it's like we've still got so much energy. But I think the sheer breadth and depth of this one is, well, I'm not pretending like we're facing the real challenges like those actually in the region. But I think it shows you, audience, viewers, listeners, that this is not an easy thing to cover, and I don't think any of us are pretending to have the answers, but simply. There are certain seismic shifts that are happening, but also very concrete steps on all sides that are going to have to happen. We'll be back, I think, on this matter. I'm going to be going back onto X and monitoring things and probably talking about this as well. So if people want to join me there, I know how these two feel about that platform, but as it stands, it's really the only social media that covers these sorts of things in real time. But I do want to give a huge shout out to Michael and James. They're very kind in joining me on these streams. I'm obviously a lot younger than them and less experienced.
Oh, so it's not so much that, it just makes us feel terribly old when we have to bring things up and realize.
How do I compliment you? Okay, they're much more experienced and insightful than I am. But I think
brings us together. You're the one that makes this happen. So you know it's all three. All three have a vital role in this.
I see. So I'm just the host who needs to shut up and let the two experts talk. I see. Thank you. No, we all have, as I say, our differences, but clearly we agree on the overall direction and realities of things. Whether or not the sort of the way that it should have played out, I think is different. But that's sort of anyway. I could go on. I'm filibustering at this point. Everyone, thank you very much for watching and joining us. If you enjoyed this, if you're new to any of our channels, don't you go and check them out. James does incredible coverage of lots of different things, similar to me, maybe a little bit more objective, whilst I dip in my opinions, hot-headedness a bit more. Michael does fantastic coverage of war in Ukraine and Russia and translating things in real time, as you should see, not sort of a simplified Western narrative. And as you can tell, he does say the things that I think perhaps a lot of people in the West aren't willing to say, or has a willingness to just be blunt and say it as it is in some ways. So, but that's it from us, I guess, for this time. If something really does change, then maybe we'll do something sooner, but we'll see. See you all soon, and best wishes. But take care out there, guys.
Stay sane, everyone.
Take care.
Bye all.